In this chapter, we are going to step into the world of real estate as an investment. When most people think of property, they think of a place to live. But for us, real estate is also a major asset class, standing alongside shares, bonds, and cash. Over the next set of slides, we will explore how property generates income, how it behaves in an investment portfolio, and what makes it so different from other assets. We will use examples in the Malaysian context by looking at the financing decisions and valuation methods, and even comparing housing loan packages. By the end, you should be able to look at a house, a shop lot, or a real estate investment trust and evaluate it not just emotionally but also as a structured investment decision. When we use the term real estate, we are actually talking about a wide range of properties: agricultural land with palm oil or paddy, industrial factories and warehouses, commercial shop lots and shopping malls, as well as residential houses and apartments. People acquire these properties for different reasons. Some buy for their own use, for example, a family home or a factory used by the business itself. Others buy for investment or even speculation, hoping to earn rental income and enjoy capital appreciation when the value rises. But these benefits are not automatic. They depend heavily on choosing the right property in the right location at the right price and then managing it well over time. When someone says, I want to invest in property, it doesn't necessarily mean buying a physical house. There are three broad ways to gain exposure to real estate. The first is direct ownership. That is, buying a property under your own name or your company's name, collecting rent, and paying all expenses yourself. The second is indirect equity investment, where you buy shares, bonds, or loan stocks issued by property companies and developers. The third is through a real property trust or real estate investment trust type structure, where many investors pool their money into a fund that owns a diversified portfolio of developed income-generating buildings. Each route offers a different mix of control, capital requirement, liquidity, and risk, and we will compare these as we go along. Real estate has several characteristics that make it quite different from other investments. First, sellability. In good times, you may sell a property fairly easily, but in bad times, finding a buyer at a reasonable price can be very difficult, especially with direct ownership. Second, liquidity. Physical property is illiquid and chunky. You cannot sell a bedroom if you need only a bit of cash. In contrast, property shares or real estate investment trust units are usually much more liquid and can be sold quickly. Third, taxation. Rental income is taxable under the Income Tax Act, so investors must consider after-tax returns. Finally, profitability. Owners of direct property look at rental income plus capital gains, while investors in listed property counters or real estate investment trusts focus on dividends plus share price appreciation. Direct ownership can offer very attractive upside. With bank financing, a relatively small amount of your own capital can control a large asset. If rents are strong and prices rise, the percentage return on your own money can be impressive. But the reverse is also true. In a downturn, when rents fall or vacancies rise, you still have to service your loan. Losses can be substantial, especially if you are highly leveraged. Indirect options, such as investing in property counters or real estate investment trusts, tend to be lower risk because they are diversified and professionally managed. The trade-off is that the potential return may be lower than the best direct deals. So each option sits at a different point on the risk-return spectrum. Investors must choose according to their objectives and risk tolerance. People and companies acquire real estate for different purposes. For individuals, the primary reason is often to own. That means to own a place to live or sometimes small shop to run a business. For firms, it might be office space, a warehouse, or a factory for their own operations. Owning these properties can bring non-cash benefits, saving on rent, creating stability, and giving the business better credit standing when banks see real assets on the balance sheet. However, we should always compare this with the alternative of renting. For corporations in particular, decisions should consider the effect of return on assets, ROA, and return on equity, ROE, not just the emotional satisfaction of owning a building. Let's look at Company X. Last year, it reported a net profit of 5 million ringgit, total assets of 250 million ringgit, and shareholders' equity or net worth of 50 million ringgit. It also paid 250,000 ringgit in rental expense. From this, we can compute two key ratios: return on assets, that is the net profit divided by total assets. In this case, 5 million over 250 million ringgit, which gives 2%, while the return on equity is net profit divided by net worth. That is 5 million over 50 million ringgit, which gives 10%. These numbers reflect the company's performance before any property purchase, and we will, we will see what happens if the firm decides to buy its own property instead of renting. Now, suppose Company X buys a property costing 15 million ringgit. Owning the building will save the annual rental of 250,000 ringgit, but it will also create an additional interest expense of 500,000 ringgit on the loan used to finance the purchase. After this move, the net profit becomes 5 million minus 500 ringgit plus the 250,000 rental saving. That is 4.75 million ringgit. Total assets rise from 250 million to 265 million ringgit because of the new property. Net worth drops slightly to 49.75 million ringgit, after paying the 250,000 ringgit deposit. When we recompute the ratios, ROA falls to about 1.8% and ROE falls to about 9.55%. On the surface, the acquisition seems to worsen performance in short term. If we only look at the ratios immediately after the purchase, we might say buying the property was a bad decision. ROA and ROE both decreased. But real estate is a long-term asset, and this short-term view is incomplete. A proper evaluation needs to consider the trend of property values. That is, will the building appreciate over time? It must also consider future rental costs if the company continues to rent and space requirements as the business grows. Over a longer horizon, owning the property could turn out to be much more beneficial than renting. So, the lesson here is that strategy and long-term considerations are crucial when evaluating real estate acquisitions. Sometimes, the line between investment and speculation is not very clear. For instance, buying a fully tenanted office unit with a long lease is closer to investment, while buying a remote piece of land purely hoping it will boom one day is closer to speculation. Bankers generally dislike financing pure speculation because the risk of default is higher and there may be no rental income to support loan repayments. Properties without immediate rental potential are especially risky. For investors who want exposure to real estate without managing tenants or taking on such specific risk, that is indirect investment through real estate investment trusts or property companies, may be more suitable as it offers diversification and professional management. When you own a property directly, your return comes primarily from two sources. The first is rental income, the monthly or yearly cash flow from tenants. This can normally be estimated by looking at comparable properties in the same area. The second is capital gain, that is, the increase in the property's market value over time. Capital gain, however, is much harder to forecast because it depends on market conditions, location, and economic cycles. To evaluate a property investment properly, we can treat it like any other capital project and use tools such as net present value, NPV, and internal rate of return, IRR, to judge whether the expected cash flows justify the price we are paying. In this example, we consider a building on leasehold land that is fully rented out at a net rental income of 25,000 ringgit per month. The tenancy agreement is valid for 2 years, after which it can be renewed for another 3 years with a 4% increase in rental. An investor plans to hold this building for 5 years and requires a minimum return of 12% per annum. We also assume because of the shortening lease, the building will not appreciate in value after 5 years. So there is no capital gain at the end. The question is, based on these rental cash flows, what is the minimum price the investor should pay for the property? To answer this, we convert the information into cash flows. First, we note that the required return is 12% per year or 1% per month when we are working with monthly cash flows. For the first 24 months, the building generates 25,000 ringgit per month. For months 26 to 60, the rent increases by 4%, giving 26,000 ringgit per month. The investor's holding period is 5 years, which corresponds to 60 months of rental income. Because there is no resale value at the end, the only cash inflows are these monthly rentals. Our task is to discount all these cash flows at 1% per month and find the NPV, which will indicate the maximum price the investor should pay. And we will use our Casio FC200V financial calculator. On the Casio FC200V financial calculator, we can use the cash flow and NPV functions. We first ensure the payment mode is set to end of period since rent is received at the end of each month. Then we enter the interest rate as 1% per month. In the cash flow editor, we input 25,000 ringgit for months 1 to 24 and 26,000 for months 25 to 60. Once all cash flows are entered, we return to the NPV function and press solve. The calculator gives an NPV of approximately 1,159,063 ringgit. This means that if the investor wants a 12% annual return, the maximum price they should pay for the property is about 1.159 million ringgit. Any price below this would give a higher return. Any price above this will give less than 12%. In this second example, we look at the same property but with a different twist. Now, the building is being offered at 2 million ringgit. In addition to the rental income pattern we saw earlier, we assume that the property's value will appreciate at 4% per annum over the 5-year holding period. The question now changes. Instead of asking what is the maximum price, we already know the price. We want to know at what rate of return will the investor actually earn given the 2 million ringgit purchase price, rental cash flows, and the expected selling price after 5 years. We start by calculating the expected terminal value after 5 years. A property that grows at 4% per year will be worth 2 million ringgit times 1.04 to the power of 5, which is approximately 2,433,306 ringgit. We then build the full cash flow timeline. At the beginning of month 1, the first month, the investor pays 2 million ringgit but receives 25,000 ringgit at the end of that month. So the net cash flow at time 1 is 1,975,000 ringgit. From month 2 to 24, the cash flow each month is 25,000 ringgit. From month 25 to 60, the monthly cash flow is 26,000 ringgit. At the end of month 61, we receive the terminal value of 2,433,306 ringgit. Using these cash flows, we can now compute the IRR, that is the rate of return that makes the NPV equal to 0. Again, by using the Casio FC200V, we enter the series of cash flows into the cash flow editor. Negative 1,975,000 for period 1, then 25,000 for periods 2 to 24, 26,000 for periods 25 to 60, and finally 2,433,306 ringgit at period 61. Once all values are keyed in, we move to the IRR solve function and let the calculator iterate. The resulting monthly IRR is about 1.5177%. If we multiply that by 12, the approximate annual rate, assuming that is not compounded, is 18.21%. This is significantly higher than the required return of 12%. So the investment is attractive. Through these examples, students can see how combining rental income with capital appreciation can raise the overall rate of return. Next, we shift from numbers to the legal framework of land use in Malaysia. Under Malaysian land laws, properties must be used according to the purpose stated on the title. For example, residential, commercial, industrial, or agricultural. Using land for a purpose different from what is specified is not allowed unless a formal land use conversion is approved, which usually involves applications, time, and additional cost. We can group land use into several primary categories: residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural, and specialized properties such as hotels, resorts, and golf courses. Understanding these categories is important because they influence value, financing, and development potential. Residential properties can be landed, such as single or double-story terrace houses, semi-detached units and bungalows, or non-landed, such as flats, apartments, condominiums, and townhouses. Commercial properties include business units like shop houses and shopping complexes, as well as office space in purpose-built office buildings. Some properties serve dual purposes. For instance, hotels may be treated as commercial for banking or tax purposes, even though people stay there overnight. The way a property is classified affects not only how it may be used, but also its valuation, taxation, and financing terms. Industrial properties include light industrial factories, storage warehouses, and heavier manufacturing facilities. For these, success factors include proximity to labor, availability of power supply, suitable roads and infrastructure, and compliance with environmental requirements. Agricultural properties, on the other hand, are used for growing rice, palm oil, rubber, fruits, and other crops. Such land often includes permission for a single building for workers or owners. These parcels are frequently located in less developed areas where access roads are crucial. Poor accessibility can significantly reduce the value of agricultural land and make it less attractive as loan collateral. We also have specialized real estate such as hotels, resorts, and golf courses. These properties operate in a different segment of the economy, serving the tourism and leisure markets. The hotel sector ranges from budget hotels to five-star international chains. Resorts and golf courses target a more niche market, offering holiday destinations and recreational facilities. Their viability depends on factors like tourist arrivals, airline connectivity, and disposable incomes. Because their performance is closely linked to business operations and not just the land, valuing these assets often requires careful analysis of occupancy rates, room rates, and operating income, rather than simply looking at land and building costs. From a banking perspective, land status and property condition matter greatly when assessing collateral. Vacant land can be risky, that is, if left unmanaged, it may attract squatters, or it may need expensive earthworks before development, and accessibility is often poor in undeveloped areas. Completed properties with a certificate of fitness or CCC are much more attractive because they are legally occupiable and the building risk is fully behind us. Okay. Properties under construction pose the risk of non-completion or abandonment, yet and financing is often granted, and buyers must be aware that they may still have to service interest even if developer fails to deliver. Banks also look carefully at whether a property is income generating. A building that is unoccupied or hard to rent out, raises questions about its location and underlying demand. Stable rental income supports loan repayment and makes the asset a stronger collateral. Tenure of ownership is another key factor. Freehold properties with perpetual ownership are usually the most preferred by financial institutions. Leasehold properties become less attractive when the remaining lease is short because selling or auctioning them can be difficult, and renewing the lease may involve high costs and strict conditions. As the tenure shortens, both value and financeability tend to fall. Real Estate Investment Trust, or REITs or REITs, were created to address some of the challenges of direct property ownership, especially liquidity and management. Instead of buying and managing a building on your own, you buy units in a trust that invests in a portfolio of completed income producing properties. Professional managers handle tenant selection, maintenance, and financing. Real estate investment trusts are typically listed on the stock exchange, so you can buy and sell units easily. They generally carry lower risk than property development companies because they focus on operating properties rather than speculative projects. Real estate investment trusts are suitable for investors seeking exposure to property appreciation, regular income, and an easier exit route than selling a physical property. In Malaysia, the Housing Developers Control and Licensing Act 1966 is a key piece of legislation that protects house buyers. It defines what constitutes housing accommodation, who is regarded as a developer, and what counts as a housing development. The Act typically applies when more than 4 units of housing are being developed for sale. Under this law, developers must use standard sale and purchase agreements, Schedule G for landed properties, and Schedule H for subdivided buildings, such as apartments and condominiums. Developers are also required to maintain a housing development account into which purchasers' payments are deposited. Withdrawals from this account are controlled, reducing the risk that funds are misused and projects are abandoned. Two milestones are particularly important for buyers and properties under construction: vacant possession and the defects liability period. Vacant possession is when the developer hands over the keys and the buyer takes physical possession of the unit. Under Schedule G, this must happen within 24 months of the contract date, and under Schedule H, within 36 months. If the developer is late, they are required to pay compensation, often at 10% per annum on the purchase price calculated on a day-to-day basis. After vacant possession, there is a defects liability period, typically 18 months, during which the developer is obliged to rectify defects that are properly reported by the purchaser. Most people do not pay for property in cash. Instead, they use an financing, a housing loan provided by a bank or financial institution. The margin of the margin of financing is the loan amount divided by the purchase price and then expressed as a percentage. For example, a 400,000 ringgit loan on a 500,000 ringgit house is an 80% margin. Higher margins are often offered for low and medium cost housing to promote home ownership. On the other hand, properties considered riskier because of location, design, or developer reputation may receive a lower margin or no financing at all. Understanding and financing is crucial because these loans shape the buyer's cash flow for many years. And financing brings several important benefits. Firstly, it supports home ownership by spreading the cost of a property over many years, making it affordable for more households. Secondly, when a bank approves a loan, it usually conducts its own valuation. This provides a second opinion on the property's value and helps ensure buyers are not paying widely above market price. Thirdly, the legal process of charging the property in favor of the bank also helps ensure that the buyer's ownership is properly documented and safeguarded. For developers and bridging financiers, having buyers with approved and financing reduces the risk of default on progress payments. Buyers also benefit from using experienced panel solicitors who handle the documentation efficiently. When looking at the property price tag, it is important to remember that the purchase price is not the only cost. Buyers may need to pay estate agent commissions, stamp duty on the transfer, and legal fees for the sale and purchase agreement. Additional costs include stamp duty on the loan charge documents and possibly mortgage insurance or related protection plans. When all these are added together, the total cost of acquiring the property can reach around 10% of the purchase price. Buyers must therefore plan ahead and ensure that they have sufficient funds not only for the down payment but also for these additional transaction costs. Before purchasing any property, investors should look carefully at several important features. The physical condition of the building is obvious. Signs of structural damage, water leaks, or poor workmanship can lead to significant repair costs. Property rights and the title deed must also be examined to ensure the seller is the legitimate owner and the property can be legally transferred. Because property cycles move slowly, the time horizon matters. Short-term buyers may be more exposed to market downturns. Location remains one of the most critical factors affecting both rental demand and resale value. Buyers also need to be aware of the possibility of government acquisition for public purposes, which can significantly alter their plans. Proper due diligence on the title helps avoid future disputes and surprises. The first step is to confirm the registered owner or owners and ensure they match the seller. Next, we check the tenure, whether the land is freehold or leasehold, and if leasehold, how many years remain on the lease. We then verify key details such as land area, land use category, and the shape of the lot, which may affect development potential. We also search for any caveats or encumbrances, such as existing charges, liens, or interest claimed by third parties. Finally, we check for notices or indications of government or utility acquisition, which could affect the long-term enjoyment of the property. Property values are driven by a combination of demand and supply dynamics. On the demand side, factors include population growth, urbanization, income levels, and household formation. Changing interest rates and the returns available on alternative investments like shares or bonds also influence how attractive property appears to investors. Political stability and government policies play a role, including real property gains tax or RPGT and policies on foreign ownership. On the supply side, the speed and ease of obtaining approvals and overcoming bureaucratic hurdles affect how quickly new units come onto the market. Availability of mortgage financing and credit standards further shape the ability of buyers to purchase properties. At a more micro level, specific features of a property strongly influence its price. Properties located within growth areas, close to employment centers or educational hubs, tend to be more valuable. Environmental quality and neighborhood safety are crucial. Clean, secure, well-maintained surroundings increase desirability. Access to public transport, highways, and amenities adds to the value. Features such as site elevation, attractive views, and larger lot size can also command premiums. Tenure matters. Freehold properties often fetch higher prices than comparable leasehold units. In some markets, cultural considerations such as feng shui or certain unit numbers can also influence demand in subtle but meaningful ways. Professional valuation of real estate is needed in many situations. Banks require valuations to determine how much they are willing to lend and to assess the adequacy of their loan collateral. Owners and investors need valuations when they want to sell, buy, or exchange properties so that they can negotiate based on realistic figures. When the government compulsorily acquires land for public purposes, compensation is calculated based on a formal assessment of value. Valuations are also needed for estate planning, corporate exercises, and asset revaluation. Even insurance companies rely on valuation to set an appropriate sum insured for fire and other property-related risks. There are three main approaches valuers use to estimate property value. The cost approach estimates what it would cost to acquire the land and construct a similar building today, including developers' profit, and then adjusts for depreciation. This method is most suitable for new or special purpose properties. The comparative sales approach looks at recent sales of comparable properties and adjusts for differences in size, location, condition, and tenure. The income approach is used for income-producing properties. It converts expected net operating income into value by dividing by an appropriate capitalization rate. In practice, valuers may use more than one method and reconcile the results to arrive at their final opinion of value. The income approach can be summarized with a simple formula. Market value, or V, equals annual net operating income, NOI, divided by market capitalization rate, R. Here, the NOI represents the gross potential rental revenue minus vacancy losses, collection losses, and operating expenses, including insurance and property taxes, but excluding financing costs. The capitalization rate or cap rate reflects the rate of return that investors require for a particular type of property in a given market. It is usually derived from analyzing recent sales of similar income producing properties. By dividing the NOI by this cap rate, we effectively convert a stream of income into a present value, giving us an estimate of what the property should be worth in the market. By this method in practice, valuers look at comparable properties. For example, imagine three similar double-story linked houses in Cheras, Segambut, and Kepong, each with known NOI and sale price. From this, we can calculate the implied capitalization rates, NOI divided by sale price. Suppose these rates are around 5.3% to 5.6%. The valuer studies these comparables and, after considering similarities and differences, selects an appropriate market cap rate, say 5.5%. If the subject property has an NOI of 16,000 ringgit per year, dividing 16,000 by 0.055 gives a market value of about 290,909 ringgit. This example shows how market evidence is used to support the choice of cap rate and, in turn, the valuation. When borrowers shop for a housing loan, banks may present various packages, fixed rates, floating rates, and multi-tier structures where rates change over time. To compare them fairly, we need proper evaluation tools. Two common yardsticks are highlighted here. The first is total interest payable over the life of the loan. This is simple but ignores the timing of cash flows. The second is the IRR approach, which treats the loan as a series of cash flows and calculates the effective cost of borrowing, fully taking into account the time value of money. In the following slides, we will see how these two approaches can lead to different conclusions. Consider a borrower who needs a 100,000 ringgit housing loan with a tenure of 10 years. The bank offers two packages. Package A is simple, a single interest rate of 6% per annum with interest calculated on monthly rest. Package B is a step rate structure. In the first year, the rate is is 4.5%. In the second year, 5.5%. In the third year, 6.25%. And from the fourth year onwards, 6.75%, all on monthly rest. At first glance, package B looks attractive because of the lower rates in the early years. But is it actually cheaper overall? We will use both the total interest approach and the IRR approach to find out. Under the total interest approach, we first calculate the monthly installment for each package and then work out how much total interest will be paid over the 10-year period. For package A, this is straightforward because the rate is fixed at 6% throughout. We calculate the monthly installment using the standard loan formula or a financial calculator. Then multiply the installment by 120 months and subtract the original principal of 100,000 ringgit. The result is the total interest payable under package A. We then perform a similar process for package B, although it is more complicated because the interest rate changes several times over the loan's life. Using the Casio FC200V financial calculator in compound interest mode, we key in N equals 120 months, I% equals 0.5% per month, which is 6% divided by 12, and PV equals 100,000. We then solve for payment, PMT, which gives a monthly installment of about 1,110.21 ringgit. Next, we use the amortization function, setting the payment range from month 1 to 120. The calculator confirms that the sum of principal repaid over the whole period is 100,000 ringgit, and the total interest paid is approximately 33,234.6 ringgit. This figure will be used later to compare against the total interest under package B. For package B, the calculation is more involved. We start with the full 10-year term at the first year rate of 4.5%, dividing by 12 to get 0.375% per month. With PV equals 100,000, the monthly installment in the first year is about 1,036.38 ringgit. At the end of year 1, we find the remaining principal, approximately 91,897.63 ringgit. We then reset N equals 108 months and interest rate to 5.5% divided by 12 and compute the new installment for year 2, which is about 1,080.72 ringgit. We repeat this process as rates change. 6.25% for year 3, giving around 1,111.23 ringgit, and 6.75% from year 4 onwards, giving about 1,139.49 ringgit. By summing all these yearly installments across the 10 years, we obtain the total interest payable for package B. When we add up all payments under package B, the total amount paid over 10 years is 133,617.96 ringgit compared to 133,234.60 ringgit under package A. Since the original loan is 100,000 ringgit, this means the total interest under package B is slightly higher than under package B. Based on this simple measure, package A appears to be the better choice. However, this approach has a major weakness. It does not consider the time value of money. Some of the interest in package B is paid much later, and money paid in the distant future is less costly in present terms than money paid today. To capture this effect properly, we turn to the IRR approach. Under the IRR approach, we treat the loan from the borrower's perspective as an investment, a cash inflow at time zero when the bank disburses 100,000 ringgit, followed by a series of cash outflows representing monthly installments. For package A, because the rate is fixed, the IRR is simply the nominal 6% per annum. The interesting case is package B. We summarize its cash flows as follows. At month 0, plus 100,000. From months 1 to 12, monthly outflows of 1,036.38. From months 13 to 24, 1,080.72. From months 25 to 36, 1,111.23. And from month 37 onwards, 1,139.49. This, by using this group cash flows, we can now apply a spreadsheet IRR function to find the effective monthly rate being charged. When we enter these cash flows into Excel and use the IRR function, we obtain a monthly IRR of about 0.4988%. Converting this into an effective annual rate, EAR, by compounding gives approximately 6.15% per year. If we multiply the monthly rate by 12, that is without the compounding factor, we get an approximate APR, or annual percentage rate, or nominal annual interest rate, that is based on simple rate, 5.985%. Comparing the nominal rates, package B's cost of borrowing, about 5.99%, is actually slightly lower than package A's 6%. This contradicts the earlier conclusion based solely on total interest. The key message is that, assuming all other factors are equal, the selection of a housing loan package should be based on IRR, because IRR fully accounts for the time value of money. Another important topic in housing finance is partial prepayment. This occurs when a borrower chooses to pay a lump sum towards the outstanding loan. In addition to regular installments, partial prepayment can significantly reduce the total interest paid over the life of the loan and often shortens the repayment period if the monthly installment remains unchanged. However, borrowers must also consider the opportunity cost of the funds used. If the money used for prepayment could have earned a high return elsewhere, then the net benefit may be smaller. The true advantage of prepayment is therefore the interest saved minus the return that could have been earned on that money in an alternative investment. Let's look at an example. Donnie took a loan of 100,000 ringgit 5 years ago at a fixed interest rate of 6% per annum. The loan was originally scheduled to be repaid over 240 monthly installments, which is 20 years. Now, after 5 years, that is after 60 installments, Donnie is allowed to make a partial prepayment of 50,000 ringgit without any penalty. We assume that the monthly installment remains the same after this prepayment. The question we want to answer is, how much interest will Donnie save over the remainder of the loan by making this 50,000 ringgit prepayment? First, we note that after 5 years, there are 240 minus 60, or 180 months of the original schedule still remaining. The monthly installment on the loan, given a principal of 500,000 ringgit at 6% over 250 months, is about 3,582.16 ringgit. Without any prepayment, the total amount Donnie would pay over the remaining 180 months is 3,582.16 multiplied by 180, which equals 644,788.8. Part of this amount is repayment of principal and the rest is interest. To see how prepayment affects this, we next calculate the outstanding principal after 5 years and then subtract the 50,000 ringgit prepayment. Using the financial calculator in compound MPD mode, we input N equals 240, I% equals 0.5% per month, PV equals 500,000, and solve to confirm the monthly installment of 3,582.16 ringgit. We then reset N equals 180 and use the amortization or present value function to find the outstanding principal after 60 months, which is about 424,498.55 ringgit. Donnie now makes a prepayment of 50,000 ringgit. So the new principal drops to 374,498.55 ringgit. Keeping the installment at 3,582.16 ringgit and the same interest rate, we solve for the new number of months needed to clear this reduced principal. The calculator gives approximately 148.3 months, meaning the loan will be paid off earlier than originally scheduled. With the new reduced term, the total amount Donnie will pay from now on is 3,582.16 ringgit multiplied by 148.3 months, giving about 531,234.33 ringgit. Recall that without prepayment, the remaining scheduled payments would have totaled 644,788.8 ringgit. We also know that before prepayment, the outstanding principal was 434,498.55 ringgit. That means the original remaining interest would have been 644,788.8 ringgit minus 434,498.55 ringgit, which equals 220,290.35 ringgit. After prepayment, the principal becomes 374,498.55 ringgit. So we can similarly compute the new remaining interest once we know how much will be repaid in total. After prepayment, Donnie's total future payments of 531,234.33 ringgit will clear a remaining principal of 374,498.55 ringgit. The difference between these two figures, about 156,735.78 ringgit, is the new remaining interest. Comparing this, okay, with the original remaining interest of 230,290.35 ringgit, we find that the interest saved is 63,454.47 ringgit. In other words, by using 50,000 ringgit to reduce his mortgage, Donnie ends up saving more than 63,000 ringgit in future interest. Ideally, this 50,000 ringgit should come from a non-interest earning source, such as cash in a current account, rather than from investments that are earning a reasonable return, because then the opportunity cost would be higher. Finally, we revisit the choice between fixed and variable interest rates on housing loans. The decision depends on several factors. One is the current level of interest rates. If rates are low but expected to rise, a fixed rate loan might offer valuable protection. Another is the expected trend in money market rates and central bank policy. Borrowers also need to consider prepayment or refinancing penalties, which can affect flexibility if they later want to switch to a better package. In some situations, refinancing can reduce borrowing costs when market rates fall, but the benefits must be weighed against legal fees and any early settlement charges. Real estate markets do not move in a straight line. They move in cycles closely linked to the broader economy. In the growth phase, demand is strong, credit is easily available, and developers rush to launch new projects. Eventually, supply catches up and the market enters a stagnation phase, where price growth slows and vacancies start to rise. If conditions worsen further, perhaps because of economic slowdown or high interest rates, the market may enter a decline phase with falling prices and distressed sales. Understanding where we are in this cycle helps investors avoid being forced to sell at the wrong time and positions them to capture opportunities when prices are low. Real estate rewards patience, knowledge, and careful timing.